Hello everyone, Sidewin here. Today I'm going to be starting a short series on party composition in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Unlike a lot of other role-playing games, Pathfinder is very based on team play, specifically on team play where you collaborate between different party members to accomplish your goals. So that means that who your party members are matters more. Like, you can't get away as easily with a party of everyone being the same character, because there are some assigned roles. So the core principle really is with Pathfinder diversity. Since it's a team game, you need to do team play. Part of that is tactically working together with your party members. I'll be covering that in a separate video. And I'll also be covering specific compositions in later videos. But this one's really on the basics of how do you put together a party combination. And really, this is how I tend to view it to start. The absolute basics for me are the least restrictive version that I could do. In general, if you are a beginner, as I'm sure many of you watching this video are, I would suggest not just sticking with the highly recommended, but adding all of the recommended as well. And the adventure dependent section is, as it says, adventure dependent. But you should generally read up a little bit on the player guide, since almost all published adventure paths have some kind of guide you can read to give you a summary. Or, if that's not an option for you, ask your GM. Make sure that you are building a character that fits the adventure. So now I'll talk a little bit about what each of these categories are. So the highly recommended is pretty much required. If you do not have this, you will have a really bad time. And I've seen what happens when you have a party without one or the other, and both times it basically just collapses. So the first one is you need to have somebody who can heal out of combat. So that is a extremely low investment and does not need a dedicated character. All you need is one person with medicine proficiency, preferably who invests a few skill feats in it. But that's not really a hard thing to do. You could also use certain, like, channel divinities or other ways to do it, but medicine is the main one. There's like 2 or 3 other options, essentially, using various focus spells. But in general, medicine, take it. One person should have medicine. It is one skill out of, typically you get like 4 or 5 each. So if you have 4 party members, that means you have minimum 16 different skills people can take, and that's a very conservative estimate. The second thing you need is someone who can deal damage. This one's fairly obvious. But yeah, you'll have a rough time if no one can hit the monster. So now for the recommended. You'll notice that this kind of follows a quick pattern that you've seen in a lot of games. Essentially, it's the pattern of striker or damage dealer, support, and a tank. And some of these roles are more flexible in Pathfinder than in other, like, video games. So I'll talk a bit more about that section on a future slide. But essentially, think of it as someone who helps others, someone who deals the damage, and someone who can take a hit. Then for the adventure-dependent specific ones, this is listed in approximate, like the first one's the most important. You want someone with a ranged attack. This is adventure-dependent only because if you're going to be in a dungeon the whole time, that might mean really cramped rooms, so you're never really going to be, like, at a distance from your enemies. But in most cases, if you're playing a standard campaign, you will eventually fight a flying enemy, and your party of all melee damage dealers will have a really rough time with that fight. So having one person who has a bow on them or who has a cantrip or something it's nice. Then the other 2 are specific skills that can be nice to have aside from medicine. And there's one on this list that isn't listed, but that's just because it's not exactly a party composition thing so much as a character build thing. But the party composition ones are, number one, someone who can basically play the role of a thief, so that's thievery and stealth. And the second one is people skills. It's always a good idea to have one person with some kind of people skill if you're not just playing a straight up dungeon crawler, hack and slash type thing, which I would bet most people are not. So then, why did I say that? Some of them I explained, but I'll explain them a little farther here. So to start, the required, it's very, very simple. You usually win combat by defeating enemies, and for the healing, Pathfinder encounter building guidelines assume the party is at or near full health at the start of each combat, and it also kind of assumes in its adventure design that you'll heal up in between combats. So, like, for example, medicine is infinite healing. It just takes 10 minutes and a skill check, and you can do it once per hour to a party member. So if you have a party of 6 people, you could conceivably heal each person once within an hour. If you take certain feats, the amount of time needed and the number of people you can heal and the recharge time all get changed. So you can use this ability more often if you invest into it. So for the recommended, this is where I'm going to talk a bit more about it. So for the damage dealer, one specification I would like to say here is you want both single target and area of effect damage. Frequently in discussions online, you'll see people overemphasizing single target damage at the expense of area of effect damage because it's sometimes focusing on specific adventure paths that mainly have encounters versus basically boss fights. There are certain adventure paths that are mostly what could be defined as boss fights. And in that case, you need single target damage dealers. To explain there, the way that Pathfinder works is each character has a bonus to any type of attack they can do. So, for instance, if you have a fighter, they get +2 over every other class on top of their proficiency bonus and strength bonus to their melee attacks. So you need someone who can stack up all those numbers and will have invested some into runes at higher levels in order to keep up with the damage. And that's especially important when you're fighting bosses, because in the case of bosses, by default, you have a very low chance of hitting, unless you have a very high attack bonus and a support. This is why the support matters, because every single +1 in Pathfinder is a +5% chance to hit and a +5% chance to crit. And if you stack your bonuses effectively, you can get more than a +1 bonus, but that's somewhat dependent on what you're using. The way you usually do that is by having a mix of support and crowd control. Both of these are kind of support roles, though, so I'm putting them together. So essentially, the way it works is if you have your support character who can use buff spells and aid your ally, then you can give your ally a +1. On the flip side, you have a crowd control character that gives the enemy trouble. So, like tripping them. That gives the enemy a -1. So with that, you have an overall of a +2. And that's a +10% chance to hit and crit. So that's +10% chance of dealing double damage on top of everything else. And if your ally is a crit fishing type of class, like a gunslinger, using a big damage gun that only really deals big damage on a crit, then if you keep stacking those bonuses, you increase the chances of landing that massive hit. And that can potentially kill a powerful enemy in one shot. Now, while all this is going on, you don't hit every time, so your enemy will get turns. That's why you need somebody who can take a bit of damage. And I'm not saying you need a dedicated tank. To be clear, there are dedicated tanks. Those are the champion, certain monk builds, certain fighter builds, and there's other ways you can do it as well, but those are the most common and the most beginner-friendly. But you can build a party without any of those. You just need someone who has some hit points and some AC. If you have a party whose average AC is let's say a 14 or something at level 1, you will be having a very rough time because enemies will hit more than 50% of the time. meaning they deal damage more than 50% of the time. And Pathfinder slightly swings towards essentially damage is a bit higher than hit points because the armor comes into the equation more. So in that case, your entire party can go down. I've seen what happens in those circumstances as well. So yeah, that's you just want someone to be able to take a hit. But once you look at these roles, you might note none of them are necessarily exclusive. Some of them are more likely exclusive than others. Like, it's easier to build a support tank than it is to build a damage dealer support because of the way actions work. Basically, if you're spending your actions attacking, you have fewer actions to use support abilities. And you can do a damage dealer that also does some support. In fact, that's a very common, very recommended fighter type of thing using the athletics actions. But in general, if you have a typical buff character, they're using up a lot of actions with spells, because the majority of buffing characters have some form of spells. So, like the Bless spell, let's use it as an example. It's a fairly low-level buff. It takes 2 actions to cast, so then you have 1 action left. And yes, you could attack with that action, but you could also move back. You just have a lot of things you can do. And generally, making an attack is not the most useful. Then there are other support things which will take free actions to cast, in which case you can't do anything else. So there's trade-offs, but essentially for almost any character, you prioritize one, and then you can have a secondary focus in another one. And then on top of that, like, you can't really take the third. You're usually limited to 2 out of 3. But you can choose which 2, and you can choose how much you're specialized in one versus the other. It's just 100% of the time in Pathfinder, you're pretty much more on one side than the other. It's really, really hard to have a character who's equally good at both without making them equally bad at both, if you understand what I'm saying there. So now to explain the adventure-dependent ones. I've already talked a bit about the ranged attack. It's really, really bad to have a party of all melee characters fighting, say, a dragon who actually flies. Now, your GM might be nice to you, but as a GM, that's not my style. So I advise my players against relying on GM kindness. Just pick up a bow or a crossbow. It's not that hard. Then for thievery and stealth, there's really 2 ways that it can become important. One is you need someone to disarm traps in your dungeon crawl or anything like that. And at the same time, if you're doing a heist, you need to be able to sneak, or you're relying on Russian stealth, which is usually not the wisest option. These skills can also be useful, say, if you're trying to track someone, because it's better to be unseen when you're tracking someone. And the reason you will really only need 1 character to have it is technically you can use Follow the Expert, which allows you to spread out your proficiencies, but sometimes you still want to have most of the characters invested in it, depending on, like, split the party concerns. Then people skills are nice to have because it's good to be able to persuade or scare or lie to others. It's fairly similar to the thievery stealth. There's certain situations in which you need it. Like if you're trying to convince the king to pay you money, you probably want to have an advantage in convincing the king rather than just relying on a straight D20 roll, especially since DCs are frequently higher than what can be achieved with just a roll. Then the last one's kind of a bonus, and it's investigation skills. So this is kind of like your ability to know things. So there's lore skills of various types, and, just lots of different things than that. And this is kind of a nice to have and kind of adventure dependent, because lore skills are multi-purpose with recall knowledge, which can allow you to essentially... With recall knowledge, you can roll for information on an opponent, which can be very useful in strategizing your tactics, or they can be used to figure out certain things from what you see. And a lot of skills that are not directly connected to being investigation lore skills can sometimes be used in investigations, such as if you're investigating a dead body, you roll with medicine. If you have any additional questions or comments on this, please put them in the comments below. I'm open to hearing any requests to add to this series. Right now, my plan is to make an additional video talking about bad party compositions and good party compositions for new players. But if you have other ideas, I am open to hearing them. Thank you for watching.